All right, I have Carolyn, Heidi, and Libs here, and we're just going to do kind of some round robin questions, going through the timeline of creative ruts, from your early ruts, the middle years, and what you do now. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. For the first question, we're going to dive into the early years, like your first creative rut. Um, what did it feel like, and what did you think was happening, Carolyn?
Yeah, I'm glad emotions. I was gonna say that right off the bat. I mean, for me, when I think about my first creative rut, it's something external that affected me emotionally, and then that just like hampers my creativity, and I just hit the rut. It's really hard for me to be creative when I'm not feeling good um, about myself. So yeah, it felt really bad, and it was very scary, and I felt like I would not be creative again.
Ooh. Heidi.
Um, I was a high school art teacher for 9 years, and I loved like making different kinds of things all the time. So I bounced from ceramics to painting to drawing to embroidery, and those were all fun. But if someone asked me, "Do you want to pause teaching and become an artist? What would you do?" I just felt kind of terrified by that question. That if someone else could tell me what to focus on, I would, but I had no internal compass around which thing could I devote myself to if I were to do something other than teaching. And that was a big rut. And then I made a quilt out of fabric, and it was this feeling of falling in love because of the process. I focused on the type of art that felt good to make rather than what looked good or was easy to talk about.
Love that. Libs.
Yeah, well, that's a really good way of describing it, Heidi. I feel like my first big creative rut was going to art college and coming out of it and thinking, well, I can't just be an artist. I can't pay bills to be an artist. So, I just took on a job in advertising and I wasn't creative for years. And then that pressure built up inside of me. Like I would get really depressed, like depressed and physically drained and tired. And then I realized, oh, wait, maybe I need to do something with my hands and my brain that's just exciting and fun just for me. So then I took a quilting class and I got hooked right away. And then it relieved that pressure and that depression. So that was my first creative rut. It wasn't short, it was like years long.
I love those answers because it kind of ties in. I was going to ask you guys, do you remember how you got through it? And it was obviously falling in love with the craft, the Heidi and Libs that you were talking about. Carolyn, do you remember how you got through that first creative rut or those first creative ruts?
Yeah, totally. It's funny hearing Heidi talk about her career change. I actually didn't even put it together, but probably my career change was started because of a creative rut. So, and I got out of that creative rut in finding quilting and becoming obsessed with quilts. And yeah, so I a background in architecture, was working in architecture, and just had a hard time imagining a future in that. And yeah, and at the same time I found quilting, and that was really where I was able to kind of light that creative fire again, because I was just so obsessed with it.
Wow. I really, that's amazing that all three of you wow, that's wonderful. Um, okay. So we're going to dive into kind of the middle years of your creative practice because you all have been creative probably your whole lives, right? But as you discovered quilting, we'll talk about it with respects to quilting, and you had some quilts under your belt, some years under your belt. So during those years, when you hit a creative rut, did you recognize that rut when it was happening? Did you think it was part of the process? Or was it still pretty debilitating? How did that creative rut feel when you were going through it? And did it stop you from going forward?
I think for me, no, I did not recognize it at the time. Sometimes for me, when you're just kind of slipping into a place of being just kind of a darker place, a place of being like challenged, it can kind of creep up on you. And so I think after having been through a couple, like especially the architecture thing, um, it really took me years coming out of that to fully recognize how much that had an effect on me. And so now yeah, so now I do pay kind of closer attention to feeling those things, recognizing those things as they're maybe happening sooner.
Was each time when you were falling into them slowly, was each time kind of like a bad surprise? Like, oh, here I am again. Like, is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. And I feel like I kind of let it get a little too deep of an issue because it doesn't always present itself in the exact same way.
Okay. Yeah. Heidi.
Um, yeah, so 9 months after I made my first fabric quilt, I quit my job to be a quilter. And initially, it was a really great question just to try to figure out, what does a quilt by Heidi Parks look like? And I started by being really inspired by the quilters of Gee's Bend, and then also wanting to not have to pay someone else to do the quilting to make it cost effective to be a quilter. So I was trying to make the quilting exciting and interesting. But I was finding then in this creative rut, maybe a year and a half into making quilts, that they just kept looking the same as each other, that there was a monotonous quality that I was observing in the work, and that I still wasn't really finding my own unique creative voice. And I started to, maybe this is more than a year and a half in, I decided that I was going to make some whole cloth quilts so I could get out of piecing and a little less copying and a little more curious. If I am working on whole cloth quilts, what does the quilting look like? And can that force me into solving a problem in the quilting that will look more like me and less like I'm just absorbing the work of so many other people? So creating a problem and showing up really curious, I think, helped me with that creative voice, creative rut that I was in.
I love that. So part of your rut was connected to not having or not knowing quite yet what your voice was.
Yeah, it wasn't a problem of not making. I was sewing, but in order to feel like an established artist who is making a career out of quilting and has something unique to share with the quilting community, I didn't feel like I was quite there yet. And so I, kept sewing and creating that problem for myself. That challenge was incredibly helpful.
Wow. Yeah, that resonates for me too, for sure. Because creative ruts do not look like not making for
Right.
me.
Yeah, it can be more ways than that.
Libs.
Well, I think in those in-between years, between doing quilting as my stress relief from my day job and then transitioning to making it my full-time job, there's definitely a shift in the ruts themselves. Like you go from, okay, I'm having a creative rut, but I'm still working and I'm still have a job to kind of keep me busy, to your ruts. When you have this as a business, you can't afford to just wallow in your depression, which is what I will do. So, I had to, yeah, and they sneak up, like, especially those early years, they would show up in very different ways. It could be, one of the big things for me was just trying to figure out, not so much like I figured out my creative voice pretty quickly, but how do I want to apply it? Do I want to focus on quilts for designers and manufacturing quilts to sell? Do I want to focus on the craft community and industry, and where do I fit within there? And those are still things that will hit me and can cause me to sort of back up and stop and overthink before will just sit and sew or sit and draw. Like I'll get so overwhelmed by just all those, like, oh my God, where do I fit feelings, that it just stops me. So yeah, those early years, I wouldn't recognize it coming on. And then it would hit me really fast. And then I would just wallow,
That's so interesting.
That difference.
Yeah, the pressure. And then I would just curl up in a quilt and just.
Glad we're all still laughing. Okay, so for my last question, what I want to know is, let me put on my glasses so I can read this. So now, now let's speak present time. Do you have tools that you use because obviously you've been in and out of this ebb and flow for years. And this is off the cuff because I didn't tell you guys I was going to ask you this. Do you have like a piece of advice for somebody who's like still kind of not fighting the fact that ruts happen, that there is an ebb and flow? So piece of advice, what do you do now? And a piece of advice.
All right. So kind of what I do now, I really try to stay in touch with myself, really check my emotions, kind of understand where I'm at. That's a very big thing that I try to do. And I also actually kind of what Libs was saying about like figuring out where to devote the energy, and especially once you start, I guess, supporting myself, being creative. There are parts of my business, parts of my creativity that I deliberately carve out for myself, and I'm very precious with those things. And so I think maybe those are a couple of my tips, are just one, to like constantly be checking in with yourself to make sure that kind of a difficultness is not creeping up on you. I mean, it will creep up on you, things happen in your life, but then to also think of ways to really be protective of the stuff that is helping you stay creatively satisfied.
Yeah, that's the best. I mean, thanks. I
Great.
needed that advice. I really needed to hear that. Protecting that some time to like nurture yourself as well.
Yep.
Nurture.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Heidi.
Yeah, I would say that my creative ruts are more like an economy flow chart, right? Like they get a little less low each time. And in the last year, I was very excited that I was a finalist for the second time in a row for the Mary Knoll Fellowship here in Milwaukee. And that was so exciting to be so close, but also I didn't get the fellowship. And a lot of the feedback that I had was that my work seemed disparate, like different types of things for different reasons. And I made a quilt for a show in Korea, and I made a quilt for an artist residency that I was in, and I made a quilt for this other thing. And they couldn't quite see the umbrella that united everything. That, like, I think to even quilters or people who were more familiar with my work, they could see it. But people who got only 8 images of my art and a 30-word statement and 15 minutes to talk to me, that they didn't know or understand that umbrella. So I stepped back, looked at my work from further away, and was able to see a little better that there is an umbrella, but I wasn't connecting it in the way that I presented the work. And that step back allowed me to see some major themes of diary, memoir, self-help, working on oneself. And that now that I've stepped back and looked at it, I can see that umbrella more clearly. And knowing that about the work has allowed me to focus in on those ideas a lot more specifically this year, and have made me a lot more excited about the work. And so even if it's, well, I had to make this to demo for a class, or I had to make this for this other thing, there's still this deeper core of what I'm going for that I think is standing out in my work in the last year. So that would be my advice as well, is step back, look at the oeuvre of things that you've made over the last year or decade or 5 decades. And there might be some answers there that make things seem more connected to each other than they seem when you're looking so close up.
I love that. And it's your creative ebb and flow is still tied with expressing your voice. Love that. Libs.
Yeah. I would sort of build on what Heidi said too. And, if you do step back and have a look, at least for me, when I do take time to look at everything I've made, I like to also set a goal for myself, like for the year or something. And it can just be a loose goal. Like this year, I want to make at least 1 quilt just for myself. But I make it a realistic goal too, because I find that I used to make like big, long to-do lists for the whole week. And now I just think, no, what are 3 things I could do today? Or what's one little thing that I could sew today? And it doesn't, like the little challenge we went through earlier, and it was just a challenge just to sew. And it felt good to just say, you know, this morning I woke up, I hadn't made anything with my hands. This afternoon I made one little thing and it made me feel really good. So setting realistic goals and not getting too overwhelmed by all of it. So I can now, like I do, and also like what Carolyn said, emotionally, I can feel it coming on. I know when I'm going to have, when I need to step back or I need to rest. And it's important to acknowledge that and give it the time it needs. And just know that you will come back out of it. But just like embrace it. Say, yeah, here I am. I'm going into this quiet moment. I'll just live with it and I'll work my way out. You're not going to be stuck forever. You can't be, you're creative. You know, you won't be.
I love that. Yeah, you're not going to be in that rut forever.
Not the end. Never the end.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. I'm like copiously taking mental notes. So thank you guys for letting me interview.
Thank you, Tara.
Thanks so much.
Bye.